What's up, boys? I'm Octavian, and I'm back with another part of the Unreal Engine 5 FPS tutorial series. In this one, we're going to be adding procedural weapon sway whenever you rotate the mouse or walk around. So that's going to improve a lot the feel of the walking and the looking and basically the entire feel of the first-person game. Let's just immediately get started. I really don't want to daddle and just waste time, so let's get started. First thing we're going to do, pretty much as always though, is going to be open one of the character blueprints. In this case is going to be the animation blueprint, so we're going to go to FPS tutorial, core, and then inside of core I'm going to open ABP character. I'm just going to double click on it. Now, last tutorial we left things with the procedural jump. I didn't really show it, but this is the procedural jump we've got going on at the moment. Not the prettiest, but it is really cool. The next thing we're going to add, or we're going to start with the mouse sway. So whenever we move our mouse, we want the weapon to kind of sway left and right. Now, the way we're going to do that is using our old friend, the transform modify bone. We're going to do pretty much the same exact thing we did with the jumping. We're going to move the weapon left and right, and we're going to let the IK take care of the rest. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's start by just duplicating this node. I'm just going to place it here. I'm going to recombine these struct pins because we don't need them to be split at the moment. And then I'm going to connect this here. And just for now, let's just call this mouse sway. Let's try starting to just at least clean up the things I add now. Okay, so we have this. We're going to need some sort of value to modify the translation and the rotation. Let's start with the translation. I'm going to right click and promote this to a variable. And let's call this mouse sway location, right? And actually, I'm going to use the new binding system. So I'm going to click here and then pin mouse sway location on the translation. Compile again. Okay, so now we have the translation bound to this location or this vector that we created. We need to set this to something. And we know we need the mouse rotation of some sort of mouse movement. We can get that from the character, but we don't really have it saved at the moment. Whenever we did the camera rotation, if we go to the character blueprint, we didn't really save the value. I'm just going to find the camera right here. You can see that in the input action for the camera, we have an action value, which is the mouse input for that frame, which is actually great, but we're not saving it. We're not storing it in any variable. So let's just do that for the moment, and then we will go back to the animation blueprint. So to do that, I'm just going to right click on the action value, promote to variable, and I'm going to call this mouse input. You can really just call these whatever you want, to be honest, though. Just make sure you know what they are. So try to be clear with it. And then mouse input, we're going to plug right into trigger directly, just the first thing. As a matter of fact, I can unhook this break vector here and just connect it to mouse input now, since that's the first thing we're doing. And we can just use that. Now let's go back to the animation blueprint, which we already have open right here. And then right at the end here, I'm going to get the character's mouse sway, and then we're going to convert it somehow to a location. Now first, though, since we have a bit of a mess here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this whole thing to the left a little bit, and then I'm going to create a variable for this by right-clicking and then promoting to variable. I'm going to call this character. Now, instead of dragging all these wires all over the place, I can just connect character to everything. That is already immediately better. So now we can save and compile, and let's go back to do the mouse thing. So if I get character, and then we get the mouse input, right here, this is the value we want. Let's first start by printing it. Just so we know what we're working with here. Just to remember. So if I look left and right, you can see that the values kind of going up and down. One thing that you will not see is that that you will see is that it never really goes to 0, and that's because one thing we're not doing at the moment is calling this when the action completes. So as a matter of fact, this is a bit of an issue. We should do that. Whenever the action is completed, or whenever we stop holding the mouse, we should call this yet again, so that it updates to 0, and also the camera kind of matches that properly. you should notice that it is even smoother now. Or, well, you might also just not notice anything, but you can at least tell from the value that we are going to 0 now. So we can see that if I rotate the mouse left and right, the X value is kind of changing, and it's going negative if I go left and positive right, and then the same thing happens with the Y value. So let's use that. If I use this mouse input, and then I add a setter for the mouse sway location, and let's just connect it here. What I can do with it is I can split this struct pin, right? Because we know left and right is going to be X, and then up and down is going to be Y. And then for this one, we don't really know the exact locations or what they correspond to, so let's just figure that out very quickly. So left and right is going to be the X. If I remove this binding for a moment, left and right is going to be the X. You can see it right there. So you can see the left and right is just changing the X, and then up and down is changing the Z. So that's the two values we're going to want to change. I'm going to bind this again to the mouse sway location, just so we're back to where we were at. And then I'm just going to connect this to the X right there, and then the Y to the Z. Now, this is kind of like when in the jumping tutorial, when we didn't smooth anything and just went immediately into setting the jump value. That's kind of the result we're going to get. But let's just compile for now and see it. If I move left and move right, you can see that it's very jerky, but we are getting mouse sway. It is definitely there. We're just not interpolating it in any way. So again, just like last tutorial, our options here are to use a float interp, or I mean even a vector interp, which is basically the same thing. We're just using linear interpolation. It's either going to be that or to use a spring interpolation. Now, I'm going to use spring interpolation for this too, because I really like spring interpolation. You could just use float interpolation or whatever else. So I'm going to copy and paste this node. I'm going to go ahead and just move it right there. One thing that I am not going to use, actually, I'm not going to use float spring interpolation. I'm going to use vector spring interpolation, just so we can use 3 axes and just do it in the same vector, or do it in the same spring interpolation node. Otherwise, we would have to add 2 of these, and that just gets messy. So let's just quickly kind of copy the settings we have. So that's 0.4, 0.6, mass is 0.006, and then we're going to need to our delta time, we're going to connect get world delta seconds. We're going to right click and promote to variable for the spring state, and we're just going to call this one mouse sway location spring state. I mean, that's usually pretty clear. And now the current in the target, naturally, current for us is going to be the current mouse sway location. Let's unhook these. And then we're going to set it to the mouse sway location, so we make sure that every frame we're updating the spring interpolation. And then we're going to take our mouse input here, and we're going to do just what we were doing before, but instead of setting the mouse sway location directly, we're going to use it in the spring interpolation. So X to the X and Y to the Z. And then now I'm just going to kind of press Q on all of that, just so it looks a little cleaner, and we can compile and save. And really, this is basically it in terms of interpolating it. If I play it now, you can see that we're getting pretty nice sway. The only thing that you usually don't get in games is that if I move my mouse up, it's going up instead of down. Usually it would be the other way around, just like here we're getting reverse. So if I move left, it goes right. So to fix that, really, we could just multiply this Y by -1, and that would resolve the issue. But instead of that, I'm going to take this vector 2, and I'm going to multiply this entirely by another vector, so we can tweak the values very easily here. So to do that, I'm just going to go to variables, create a variable. I'm going to call this one mouse sway amplitude. And amplitude is really just going to determine on each axis how much movement we get. This is also going to allow us to control that, not only the direction. We're going to go to variable type, and then in there, go vector. You can compile just so we don't get any issues. Now let's drag this one here. And what we can do is we can take this struct, recombine it. Oh, sorry, don't promote to variable. Recombine it and then multiply. And we can multiply by this vector. Now this will basically give us it's going to multiply the X by the X, the Y by the Y, and then Z by 0 because there's no Z. or by 1. I'm not entirely sure actually, but either way would be fine for us. And then we're going to take the result of this and break it. And again, x to x and z to z. That's still the same thing. So let's just press Q on that yet again. And let's just drag this somewhere a little more easy to read. And now compile and make sure that under edit defaults, don't change it in the preview because this does not get saved. So edit defaults, you scroll down to the mouse sway amplitude, and then you change these to 1 and 1. In our case, we're going to set this one to -1 because this is the one we were looking to change. So if I now compile and play, I can see that, first of all, we're not actually getting anything. And that's because, this is my issue, I changed the Y, and what we're using is the Z. So I actually modify that like that. Oh, and really, we're still getting an issue here. That is very interesting. Okay, so it seems like maybe we're multiplying a little bit oddly here. So instead of that, what we could do is we could make a vector 3 out of this. Let's just type make vector. And then out of these inputs right here, of the mouse input, we can again right-click, split struct pin, place this into the X and the Y, and then take this and multiply it by the mouse sway amplitude. And now just take the result of this whole thing and add it to the break. So now we'll be able to, instead of modifying this one, it'll be mouse Y on the Y. And we are still not having a working result, which is very interesting. I'm not entirely sure why, to be honest. It almost seems like we're not saving this in some weird way. Let's try to set this to 1 for a moment here. If this gets very long, I will skip it. Yeah, it seems like we're not saving that. It's like we're not going up and down. Oh, that is because right here we were using the Z instead of the Y. That's the issue we're having. So if I set it back, now we're going to have the same result as before. So if I go back and modify this to -1 and go in, if I move up, it's going to go down. Now we have perfect sway. This is generally the kind of sway you have in games. Naturally, we have a lot of it while aiming, which we don't really want. Generally, you don't want a lot of sway while aiming. It's fine to have a lot while kind of moving around. And even there, I would probably tune this or kind of turn this a little bit down. So I'm just going to go to maybe even 0.6, honestly. 0.6 and -0.6. And go in here, and now you're going to see that we have a lot less. Now, let's fix the aiming thing. Again, if we go to the atom graph, we're currently using this everywhere, or we're applying this everywhere. So no matter, and you can see that because it's right at the end of the blueprint. In fact, if I move these nodes around a little bit, you will see that we are literally right before the end of the blueprint, which in this case is fine, but also does not really allow us to control how we're changing these based on anything. So there's a few ways for us to modify this. We can either, for example, move this node over to the specific states. So in the idle or walk loop, and then in the aim or walk loop, we could add the thing right here. Or what we could do is multiply this mouse sway location by something if we're aiming. Now, to me, that seems like an easier option. So I'm just going to do that for this tutorial. I can take the be aiming value, get it, and then what I can do is I can call a select float action. I think we've done this before. And then I will use this select float action to, if we are aiming, modify the kind of the sway to 0.3. So we will multiply the sway by 0.3 if we're aiming, and if we're not, I'm just going to keep it at 1. So it's going to be exactly the same. So now I can just grab my entire sway right here and then multiply by a float and then drag the result of that into the thing we're using. So as you can see now, we're multiplying by 0.3 when we're aiming. So if I go in here, I can look around, and then if I aim, it's going to be a lot tinier. That's really good. The only real issue we have at the moment, I mean, is still that 0.3 is a bit too much still. So maybe I will promote this to a variable. Let's right click and let's just say mouse sway aiming multiplier. And if we compile and go to edit defaults, we can now edit it here. So I'm going to set it to 0.15 instead. But now if I aim and look around, there's not that much sway. And even then, I would maybe turn it around a little bit, but for now, that's going to be correct. Now, we've done that. There's still a few more things that we can do. One thing we can do, which I think is very interesting, is instead of making a rotation value for this, because generally rotation sway doesn't feel that good, at least not by itself, we would have to play around with it a little bit. Instead of that, let's try to first add some sort of sway or lag when we move around. So we're going to do exactly the same thing that we're doing here, but instead of the mouse, we're going to use the keyboard input. So let's duplicate this. We're going to call this, you can call it movement sway. That's what we usually call it in our assets. I can duplicate pretty much every variable that we have. So I'm going to duplicate this and call it, just call it move sway location. And I am going to make a move sway amplitude too. Move sway amplitude. And we're going to need more things, but for now, let's just go with that. If I in here assign move sway, not the amplitude, be careful with that, location. And then I take that and add it right there. That's going to be great. So we can do that, connect this back, keep that clean. Now we have the move sway. We can go to the event graph, and what we will need to update this move sway is kind of the same setup we have here. So for the most part, I'm just going to copy it. Control C, Control V. And I will connect it to the execution pin. And we'll need to change a few things around. Make sure, first of all, do not use the same spring state. Otherwise, these two will somehow mess around with the same values, and that will not look cool. So let's delete this and then duplicate this one and just call it move sway location spring state. And then assign that one. That would be great. And then instead of mouse sway location, you can take move sway location and just drag it over. And that will replace the references. Same for the move or the mouse sway amplitude here. Just replace it with move sway amplitude. And now the only thing remaining is that we're currently applying this through the mouse input. So we don't want to do that with the mouse input. We want to do it with the keyboard movement input. So the way we're going to do that is simply going back to the character and doing exactly the same thing we did with the mouse input right here, but with the movement. And the movement is right here. Setup looks pretty much the same, so we can just duplicate mouse input, call it move input. Then drag the move input right there. Connect it at the start. Let's also make sure to do that little trick that we did before. Connect completed to the whole thing. And then take the move input and connect it there so we don't have to keep things that tightly kind of packed. We can move it around a little bit if we wanted to. Now let's compile, go back to the animation blueprint, and replace this get with the mouse input or the move input. And again, let's use the same setup. So it's going to be X to X. And now before with the mouse, we were going, oh, actually we were going Y to Y. So let's go Y to Y here too. The one thing we are going to change is that I'm going Y to Z here, which is going to be up. Perhaps with movement, you don't really want the weapon going up when I move forward with the Y. So instead of that, I'm just going to go Y to Y. And we can compile. Ensure that your amplitude is something reasonable too. In this case, it's just going to be set to whatever the mouse sway amplitude was set to. And take into account that we are using the mouse sway aim multiplier right now. But let's just, for now, let's just take a look and see what we got. So if I look around, we have sway. If I aim, we have sway. And now if we move, you can see that the gun moves to kind of follow that, which feels very nice. The one thing I would change now is that since the forward and backward is negative, we get kind of the opposite result to what I'm looking for. So I'm just going to go 0.6 here. Well, that feels great. This is really good. I can look around. I can move around. That feels really good. And then same thing, if I just move, you can see that we have sway while aiming. And I can jump. We have a little bit of sway there. This is really good. Let's just make a multiplier for the move sway here for when aiming. We'll just duplicate the mouse sway aiming multiplier and call it move sway aiming multiplier. And then just take this one and replace the other one. I'm not doing this because I want to change this, really. I mean, the values seemed pretty okay, but I do think it is important to have variables here for most of these things. And with that, we are basically done for this tutorial. We have procedural, mouse, and movement sway, and both of them feel really good, so we can kind of end it there. I hope you enjoyed it. I do think in one future tutorial, we might also add some rotation sway, but if you've seen me add the location sway for all of these, you can probably add the rotation by yourself. And if you can, just let me know in the comments and I'll make a tutorial about it. But yeah, for now, that was it. I'll see you in the next tutorial when we will finally get to starting to add some interesting things like shooting projectiles, which is really exciting and we haven't done, and we have a lot of animations but no projectiles. So let's get to that. I'll see you in that one.